Section 46 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Agnew. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 3, Section 46, Essay on Honoré de Balzac, by William P. Trent, Part 1. Honoré de Balzac, by common consent the greatest of French novelists, and to many of his admirers the greatest of all writers of prose fiction, was born at Tours, May 16, 1799. Neither his family nor his place of birth counts for much in his artistic development, but his sister Laure, afterwards Madame Surville, to whom we owe a charming sketch of her brother, and many of his most delightful letters, made him her hero through life, and gave him a sympathy that was better than any merely literary environment. He was a sensitive child, little comprehended by his parents or teachers, which probably accounts for the fact that few writers have so well described the feelings of children so situated. See Le Lys dans la Vallée, The Lily in the Valley, and Louis Lambert. He was not a good student, but undermined his health by desultory through enormous reading, and by writing a precocious treatise on the will, which an irate master burned, and the future novelist afterwards naively deplored. When brought home to recuperate, he turned from books to nature, and the effects of the beautiful landscape of Touraine upon his imagination are to be found throughout his writings, in passages of description worthy of a nature worshipper like Senancour himself. About this time a vague desire for fame seems to have seized him, a desire destined to grow into an almost morbid passion. And it was a kindly providence that soon after, 1814, led his family to quit the stagnant provinces for that nursery of ambition, Paris. And he studied under new masters, heard lectures at the Sorbonne, read in libraries, and finally, at the desire of his practical father, took a 3 years' course in law. He was now at the parting of the ways, and he chose the one nearest his heart. After much discussion, it was settled that he should not be obliged to return to the provinces with his family, or to enter upon the regular practice of law, but that he might try his luck as a writer on an allowance purposely fixed low enough to test his constancy and endurance. 2 years was the period of probation allotted, during which time Balzac read more widely, and walked streets studying the characters he met, all the while endeavouring to grind out verses for a tragedy on Cromwell. This, when completed, was promptly and justly damned by his family, and he was temporarily forced to retire from Paris. He did not give up his aspirations, however, and before long he was back in his attic, this time supporting himself by his pen. Novels, not tragedies, were what the public most wanted, so he laboured indefatigably to supply their needs and his own necessities, not relinquishing, however, the hope that he might some day watch the performance of one of his own plays. His perseverance was destined to be rewarded, for he lived to write 5 dramas, which fill a volume of his collected works. But only one, the posthumous comedy Mercader, was even fairly successful. Yet that Balzac had dramatic genius his matured novels abundantly prove. The 10 romances, however, that he wrote for cheap booksellers between 1822 and 1829 displayed so little genius of any sort that he was afterwards unwilling to cover their deficiencies with his great name. They have been collected as youthful works, œuvres de jeunesse, and are useful to a complete understanding of the evolution of their author's genius, but they are rarely read, even by his most devoted admirers. They serve, however, to enable him to get through his long and heart-rending period of apprenticeship, and they taught him how to express himself, for this born novelist was not a born writer, and had to labour painfully to acquire a style which only at rare moments quite fitted itself to the subject he had in hand. Much more interesting than these early sensational romances were the letters he wrote to his sister Honoré, in which he grew eloquent over his ambition, and gave himself needed practice in describing the characters with whom he came in contact. But he had not the means to wait quietly and ripen. So he embarked in a publishing business which brought him into debt. Then, to make up his losses, he became partner in a printing enterprise which failed in 1827, leaving him still more embarrassed financially, but endowed with a fund of experience which he turned to rich account as a novelist. Henceforth the sordid world of debt, bankruptcy, usury, and speculation had no mystery for him, and he laid it bare in novel after novel, utilizing also the knowledge he gained of the law, and even pressing into service the technicalities of the printing office. See Illusions perdues, lost illusions. But now, at the age of 28, he had over 100,000 francs to pay, and had written nothing better than some cheap stories. The task of wiping out his debts by his writings seemed, therefore, a more hopeless one than Scott's. Nothing daunted, however, he set to work, and the year that followed his second failure in business saw the composition of the first novel he was willing to acknowledge, Les Chouans. This romance of Brittany in 1799 deserved the praise it received from press and public, in spite of its badly jointed plot and overdrawn characters. It still appeals to many readers, and is important to the Comédie Humaine as being the only novel of the military scenes. The Physiology of Marriage followed quickly, 1829-30, and despite a certain puerancy of imagination, displayed considerable powers of analysis, powers destined shortly to distinguish a story which ranks high among its author's works. La Maison de Chat qui Piaule, 1830, this delightful novelette, the queer title of which is nearly equivalent to At the Sign of the Cat and the Racket, showed in its treatment of the heroine's unhappy passion the intuition and penetration of a born psychologist, and in its admirable description of bourgeois life the pictorial genius of the genuine realist. In other words, the youthful romancer was merged once and for all with the matured novelist. The years of waiting and observation had done their work, and along the streets of Paris now walked the most profound analyst of human character that had scrutinized society since the days when William Shakespeare, fresh from Stratford, trod the streets and lanes of Elizabethan London. The year 1830 marks the beginning not merely of Balzac's success as the greatest of modern realists, but also of his marvellous literary activity. Novel after novel is begun before its predecessor is finished. Short stories of almost perfect workmanship are completed. Sketches are dashed off that will one day find their appropriate place in larger compositions, as yet existing only in the brain of the master. Nor is it merely a question of individual works. Novels and stories are to form different series, scenes from private life, philosophical novels, and tales, which are themselves destined to merge into studies of manners in 19th century, and finally to the Comédie Humaine itself. Yet it was more than a swarm of stories that was buzzing in his head. It was a swarm of individuals, often more truly alive to him than the friends with whom he loved to converse about them. And just because he knew these people of his brain, just because he entered into the least details of their daily lives, Balzac was destined to become more than a mere philosopher or student of society, to wit, a creator of characters, endowed with that absolute dramatic vision which distinguished Homer and Shakespeare and Chaucer. But because he was also something of a philosopher and a student of sociology, he conceived the stupendous idea of linking these characters with one another and with their several environments, in order that he might make himself not merely the historian, but also the creator of an entire society. In other words, conservative though he was, Balzac had the audacity to range himself by the side of Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, and to espouse the cause of evolution even in its infancy. The great ideas of the mutability of species and the influence of environment and heredity were, he thought, as applicable to society as zoology, and as applicable to fiction as to either. So he meditated the Comédie Humaine for several years before he announced it in 1842, and from being almost the rival of Saint-Hilaire, he became almost the anticipator of Darwin. But this idea of evolution was itself due to the evolution of his genius, to which many various elements contributed: his friendships and enmities with contemporary authors, his intimacies with women of refinement and fashion, his business struggles with creditors and publishers, his frequent journeys to the provinces and foreign countries, and finally his grandiose schemes to surround himself with luxury and the paraphernalia of power, not so much for his own sake as for the sake of her whose least smile was a delight and an inspiration. About each of these topics an interesting chapter might be written, but here a few words must suffice. After his position as an author were more or less assured, Balzac's relations with the leaders of his craft, such as Victor Hugo, Théophile Gautier, and George Sand, were on the whole cordial. He had trouble with Sainte-Beuve, however, and felt that his brother writers begrudged his success. His constant attacks on contemporary journalists, and his egotist and erratic manners naturally prejudiced the critics, so that even the marvellously romance entitled La Peau de Chagrin, The Magic Skin, 1831, a work of superb genius, speedily followed as it was by Eugénie Grodin and Le Père Goriot, did not win him cordial recognition. One or two of his friendships, however, gave him a knowledge of higher social circles than he was by birth entitled to, a fact which should be remembered in face of the charge that he did not know high life, although it is true that a writer like Balzac, possessing the intuition of genius, need not frequent salons or live in hovels in order to describe them with absolute verisimilitude. With regard to Balzac's debts, the fact should be noted that he might have paid them off more easily and speedily had he been more prudent. He cut into profits of his books by the costly changes he was always making in his proof-sheets, changes which the artist felt to be necessary, but against which the publishers naturally protested. In reality, he wrote his books on his proof-sheets, for he would cut and hack the original version and make new insertions until he drove his printers wild. Indeed, composition never became easy to him, although under a sudden inspiration he could sometimes dash off page after page while other men slept. He had, too, his affectations. He must even have a special and peculiar garb in which to write. All these eccentricities, and his outside distractions and ambitions, as well as his noble and pathetic love affair, entered into the warp and woof of his work, with effects that can easily be detected by a careful student, who should remember, however, that the master's foibles and peculiarities never for one moment set him outside the small circle of men of supreme genius. He belongs to them by virtue of his tremendous grasp of life in its totality, his superhuman force of execution, and the inevitableness of his art at its best. The decade from 1830 to 1840 is the most prolific period of Balzac's genius in the creation of individual works. That from 1840 to 1850 is his greatest period of philosophical coordination and arrangement. In the first he hewed out materials for his house, in the second he put them together. This statement is, of course, relatively true only, for we owe the second decade three of his greatest masterpieces, Splendeur et Misère des Courtisans, and La Cousine Bête, and Le Cousin Pont, collectively known as Les Parents Pauvres, Poor Relations. and what a period of masterful literary activity the first decade presents. For the year 1830 alone, the Viscount de Spielberg de Louvenjoul gives 71 entries, many of slight importance, but some familiar to every student of modern literature, as El Verdugo, La Maison de Chat qui pleut, Gobseck, Adieu, Un Passion dans le désert, A Passion in the Desert, Un épisode sur la terreur, An Episode of the Terror. For 1831 there are 76 entries, among them such masterpieces as Le Réquisitionnaire, The Conscript, Les Proscrits, The Outlaws, La Peau de Chagrin, and Jésus-Christ en Flandre. In 1832 the number of entries falls to 36, but among them are Le Colonel Chaubert, Le Curé de Tours, The Priest of the Tours, La Grande Bréchette, Louis Lambert, and Les Maranads. After this year there are fewer short stories. In 1833 we have Le Médecin de Campagne, The Country Doctor, and Eugénie Grodin, with parts of L'Histoire de les 13, Story of the 13, and Les Contes Drôlatiques, Droll Tales. The next year gives us La Recherche de l'Absolu, Search for the Absolute, and Le Père Goriot, Old Goriot. And during the next 6 there are no less than a dozen masterpieces. Such a decade of accomplishment is little short of miraculous, and the work was done under stress of anxieties that would have crushed any normal man. But anxieties and labors were lightened by a friendship which was an inspiration long before it ripened into love, and was rendered bearable both by Balzac's confidence in himself and by his even nearer view of the goal he had set himself. The task before him was as stupendous as that which Comte had undertaken, and required not merely the planning and writing of new works, but the utilization of all that he had previously written. Untiring labor had to be devoted to this manipulation of old material, for practically the great output of the 5 years, 1829-1834, was to be coordinated internally, story being brought into relation with story, and character with character. This meant the creation and management of an immense number of personages, the careful investigation of the various localities which serve for environments, and the profound study of complicated social and political problems. No wonder, then, his maturity shows a falling off in abundance, though not an intensity of creative power, and that the gradual breaking down of his health, under the strain of his ceaseless efforts and his abnormal habits of life, made itself more and more felt in the years that followed the great preface which in 1842 sets forth the splendid design of the Comédie Humaine. This preface, one of the most important documents in literary history, must be carefully studied by all who would comprehend Balzac in his entirety. It cannot be too often repeated that Balzac's scientific and historical aspirations are important only in so far as they caused him to take a great step forward in the development of his art. The nearer the artist comes to reproducing for us life in its totality, the higher the rank we assign him among his fellows. Tried by his canon, Balzac is supreme. His interweaving of characters and events through a series of volumes gives verisimilitude to his work unrivalled in prose fiction, and paralleled only in the work of the world poets. In other words, his use of coordination upon a vast scale makes up for his lack of delicacy and sureness of touch, as compared with what Shakespeare and Homer and Chaucer had taught us to look for. Hence he is with them even if not of them. This great claim can be made for the Balzac of the Comédie Humaine only. It could not be made for the Balzac of any one masterpiece like Le Père Goriot, or even the Balzac of all the masterpieces taken in lump and without coordination. Balzac by coordination has, in spite of his limitations, given us a world just as Shakespeare and Homer have done. And so Taine was profoundly right when he put him in the same category with the greatest of all writers. When, however, he added St. Simon to Shakespeare, and proclaimed that with them Balzac was the greatest storehouse of documents that we have on human nature, he was guilty not merely of confounding genres of art, but also of laying stress on the philosophic rather than on the artistic side of fiction. Balzac does make himself a great storehouse of documents on human nature, but he also does something far more important. He sets before us a world of living men and women. To have brought this world into existence, to have given it order in the midst of complexity, and in spite of the fact that death overtook him before he could complete his work, would have been sufficient to occupy a decade of any other man's life. But he, though harassed with illness and with hopes of love and ambition deferred, was strong enough to do more. The year 1840 saw the appearance of Pierrette, and the establishment of the ill-fated Revue Parisienne. The following year saw Ursule Mirouet, and until 1848 the stream of great works is practically unbroken. The Splendeurs et Miséries and the Parents Pauvres have been named already, but to these must be added A Ménage de Garçons, A Bachelor's Housekeeping, Modeste Mignon, and Les Paysans, the Peasants. The 3 following years added nothing to his work and closed his life, but they brought him his crowning happiness. On March 14th, 1850, he was married to Madame Henska of Berdichev. On August 18th, 1850, he died at Paris. Madame Evelina de Henska came into Balzac's life about 1833, just as he had shaken off the unfortunate influence of the Duchesse de Castries. The young Polish countess was much impressed, we are told, by reading the Scènes d'une vie privée, scenes of a private life, and was somewhat perplexed and worried by Balzac's apparent change of method in La Peau de Chagrin. She wrote him over the signature L'étranger, a foreigner, and he answered in a series of letters recently published in the Revue de Paris. Not long after the opening of this correspondence the two met, and a firm friendship was cemented between them. The lady was about 30, and married to a Russian gentleman of large fortune, to whom she had given an only daughter. She was in the habit of travelling about Europe to carry on his daughter's education, and Balzac made it his pleasure and duty to see her whenever he could, sometimes journeying as far as Vienna. In the interim he would write her letters, which possess great charm and importance to the student of his life. The husband made no objection to the intimacy, trusting both to his wife and to Balzac. But for some time before the death of the aged nobleman, Balzac seems to have distrusted himself, and to have held slightly aloof from the woman whom he was destined finally to love with all the fervour of his nature. Madame Henska became free in the winter of 1842-3, and the next summer Balzac visited St. Petersburg to see her. His love soon became an absorbing passion, but consideration for her daughter's future withheld a lady's consent to a betrothal till 1846. It was a period of weary waiting, in which our sympathies are all on one side, for if ever a man deserved to be happy in a woman's love, it was Balzac. His happiness came, but almost too late to be enjoyed. His last 2 years, which he spent in Poland with Madame de Henska, were oppressed by illness, and he returned to his beloved Paris only to die. The struggle of 30 years was over, and although his immense genius was not yet fully recognized, his greatest contemporary, Victor Hugo, was magnanimous enough to exclaim, hearing that he was dying, "Europe is on the point of losing a great mind." Balzac's disciples feel that Europe really lost its greatest writer since Shakespeare. In the definitive edition of Balzac's writings in 24 volumes, 17 are occupied by the various divisions of the Comédie Humaine. The plays take up 1 volume, and the correspondence, not including of course the letters to L'Étranger, another, the Contes Drôlatiques still another, and finally we have 4 volumes filled with sketches, tales, reviews, and historical and political articles left uncollected by their author. The Contes are 30 in number, divided into dixains, each with its appropriate prologue and epilogue. They purport to have been collected in the abbeys of Touraine and set forth by Sieur de Balzac for the delight of the Pantagruelists, and none others. Not merely the spirit of the very language of the Rabelais is caught with remarkable verve and fidelity, so that from the point of view of style Balzac has never done better work. A book which holds by Rabelais on one hand, and by the Queen of Navarre on the other, is not likely, however, to appeal to that part of the English and American reading public that expurgates its Chaucer, and blushes at the mention of Fielding and Smollett. Such readers will do well to avoid les contes drôlatiques, although, like Don Juan, they contain a great deal of what was best in their author, of his frank, ebullient, sensuous nature, lighted up here at least by a genuine, if scarcely delicate humour. Of direct suggestion of vice, Balzac was, naturally, as incapable as he was of smug puritanism, but it must be confessed that as a raconteur his proper audience, now that the monastic orders have passed away, would be a group of middle-aged club men. The Comédie Humaine is divided into three main sections. First, and most important, the Études de Morale, studies of manners. Second, the Études philosophiques, philosophic studies. And finally, the Études analytiques, analytic studies. These divisions, as M. Barré points out in his L'œuvre de Balzac, the work of Balzac, were intended to bear one another the relations that moral science, psychology, and metaphysics do to one another with regard to the life of man, whether as an individual or as a member of society. No single division was left complete at the author's death, but enough was finished and put together to give us the sense of moving in a living, breathing world, no matter where we make our entry. This, as we have insisted, is the real secret of his greatness. To think, for example, that the importance of Seraphita lies in the fact that it gives Balzac's view on Swedenborgianism, or that the importance of Louis Lambert lies in its author's queer theories about the human will, is entirely to misapprehend his true position in the world of literature. His mysticism, his psychology, his theories of economics, his reactionary devotion to monarchy, and his idealization of the Church of Rome may or may not appeal to us, and have certainly nothing that is eternal or inevitable about them. But in his knowledge of the human mind and heart, he is as inevitable and eternal as any writer has ever been, save only Shakespeare and Homer. The Études de Morale were systematically divided by their author into scenes of private life, scenes of provincial life, scenes of country life, scenes of Parisian life, scenes of political life, and scenes of military life. The last three divisions representing more or less exceptional phases of existence. The group relating to Paris is by far the most important and powerful, but the provincial stories show almost as fine workmanship, and furnish not a few of the well-known masterpieces. Less interesting, though still important, are the Scenes of Private Life, which consist of 24 novels, novelettes, and tales, under the following titles: Beatrix, Albert Sauvras, La Fausse Maîtresse, the False Mistress, Le Message, the Message, La Grande Bêche, Études de Femmes, Study of Women, Autre Étude de Femmes, another study of women, Madame Firmani, Modeste Mignon, Un début dans la vie, an interest upon life, Pierre Grassou, Memoirs de deux jeunes mariés, recollections of a young couple, La maison de chat qui pilote, Le bal de Cieux, the ball of Cieux, Le contrat du mariage, the marriage contract, La vendetta, La paix de ménage, household peace, Un double famille, a double family, Un fille d'Ève, a daughter of Eve, Honorine, La femme abandonnée, the abandoned wife, La grenadière, La femme de 30 ans, the woman of 30. End of section 46. Recording by